My name's Niles Parker. I'm the Gosnell Executive Director at the NHA, and a real treat to welcome you here tonight. I am thrilled that we're having this conversation in this panel, and to welcome these two gentlemen here and thank them for their work that they've done with the Tony Sarg exhibition that started at the Norman Rockwell Museum and then came here. Both of them very, very involved in making that happen. Both of them are contributors to the catalog. If you haven't seen that yet, it's available at the museum shop. But both contributed chapters to the catalog. Both major Tony Sarg researchers over the years, and two of the most prominent Tony Sarg collectors, I would say as well, and two friends. And so I'm going to introduce them one at a time, and they're each going to say a bit about their work. And then, as I say, I've got some questions for them, and we'll follow up with questions from the audience as well. I'm going to start with George. George Korn. George worked as a project advisor for Tony Sarg, Genius at Play, as I mentioned, at the Rockwell, and has helped us, I can't count how many times over the years, with the Tony Sarg collection and other things here at the NHA. He is the founder of the Forager House Collection, which was an art and antiques gallery on Nantucket, which he owned and operated for 20 years. George launched his career as an educator. He worked as an assistant and acting director of the New Jersey State Council on the Arts. He has curated exhibitions for the New Jersey State Museum and the Key West Art and Historical Society. He has written articles for Antiques and the Arts Weekly, the Trenton Times in New Jersey, Historic Nantucket, the Nantucket Inquirer and Mirror, and other periodicals. He is also the co-author of the Trenton Battle Monument, Eakins Bronzes, Richard Kemble, a Retrospective, and Tony Sarg, the Forager House Collection. He has been a longtime supporter of the NHA and a friend. And I can't tell you how happy I am to have you here. We've been talking about this for 25 years, George, and it's happened. Yeah.
At least 25.
So welcome.
I think it was in the late 90s when Niles got here, and that's when Frank Milligan had come, and I approached them with the idea of doing a Tony Sarg exhibit. And we talked, and it never got off the ground for a number of reasons. After a while, Frank left, Niles left. My husband, who was a supporter, I became a caretaker for him. And like everything sort of dropped. And about 5 or 6 years ago, the Norman Rockwell contacted me and said, we understand that you are a Sarg collector and a Sarg, very knowledgeable person about Sarg, and would you help us? We want to do a Sarg exhibit. And I happened to be renting a house in the Berkshires at that time, and I said, yeah, can I come over tomorrow because our rental is up the next day? And so we talked, and they hired me as a project director, and I advised them for the exhibition that they were putting together. They were not cognizant at that time about the wealth of material that the NHA had in their collections. And I said, well, that's where the bulk of this exhibit should be coming from, and they should be involved. And over a period of time, it all worked out that way, that they borrowed so much, and I put them together with the NHA and Michael, and anyway, it happened. And that's how this exhibit has come together. I think I feel as though I was a major part of getting it together. My interest in Sarg is rather interesting in that I retired from what I was doing with the state of New Jersey as a curator at the New Jersey State Museum and as the director of the New Jersey State Council on the Arts, and wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And I pursued a short time as a restaurateur in Bucks County and sold that and came to Nantucket and decided I had the opportunity to start a business. And not knowing what I was completely doing, it was going to be art and antiques. And that was 1983. It was the same year that the NHA had put together a small exhibit of Sarg at the Fair Street Museum, when it was a museum, not before it became the library. The museum, when there was stairs that went up and a balcony around the top. And anyway, they put together an exhibit of Tony Sarg. Well, as a new person on Nantucket and looking at, I had already had a home here, but now I started to say, hey, I'm going to have a shop and I'm going to have art and antiques. I have to find things that are of interest to people that I might become clients here in Nantucket. And I looked at the Sarg exhibit and I said, oh my God. As a student in New Jersey, I often went to New Hope, where he had a shop. And that shop, which remained open, he had already deceased. He died in 1942. This was in the 60s when I went, his shop was still there, but it made an impression upon me because it was filled with his illustrations all over the walls and so forth. And I said, oh, I identify with him there. And then I realized, oh, he worked in New York. I worked in New York for a while too. And he had a shop in Nantucket. And that's what I just started. I said, this is too coincidental. And as a person who decided that, to have a shop, and I wasn't sure what kind of emphasis I was going to have, I found out by going to places like Brimfield and asking around, do you have anything by Tony Sarg? Tony Sarg. And I developed a network of people who were feeding me objects. And I had actually, shortly after I had a shop on Center Street, I had come into a cache of about 25 original drawings that he had done for Parents Magazine. And I decided, well, I'm going to have an exhibition of Sarg, my own exhibition. But in order to make these illustrations meaningful, I took photographs of them. I did faxes of some of the things. I took bits and pieces to the New York Public Library. And on microfilm, I found every one of these illustrations where they were or where they had appeared in Parents Magazine, and then I could document every one of these drawings as to when it was done, at what issue of the magazine it appeared, what story it appeared with, and made, as being a museum person, I made everyone cognizant of the fact of where it came from, the whole thing. I also did the same thing with the Saturday Evening Post. When my husband was dying, or not dying, but he was in intensive care for a whole summer in Boston, I spent all of my waking hours at the Boston Public Library going through the Saturday Evening Posts on microfilm and finding out every one of his stories and the illustrations that he did and cataloging those. So I went from someone who just casually met him coincidentally to someone who said, hey, this is somebody that should be acknowledged and should be given the credit that he's due. And I'm happy that through that early collecting that I did, that it developed into what we have here today. Many of the objects in this exhibition I either own, have donated to the NHA, or I have owned, and they are now owned by other collectors. But I go through the exhibition, I say, oh, I used to own that, I used to own that, I used to own that, and it's sort of very exciting for me.
Thank you very much. I think a few things that you said that we want to come back to, particularly some of the research that you did as a collector, becoming a scholar, learning more about what you were collecting and why. I think that's a theme we'll come back to again. But I want to introduce Darin. Darin Johnson is the founding artistic director of the American Theater for Puppetry Arts, a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing puppetry in the United States by introducing the art form and vocation of puppetry to broader and more diverse individuals, audiences, and communities. And again, Darin was extensively involved in the Tony Sarg Genius at Play exhibition, both here and at the Norman Rockwell Museum. From 2014 to 2017, Darin served as Vice President of Visitor Experience at Old Sturbridge Village, the nation's second largest living history museum located in central Massachusetts. At the museum, Darin conceived and produced outdoor theatrical productions, including 2 sold-out seasons of the Sleepy Hollow Experience, Midwinter Mischief, which was an immersive museum and dining experience, and an outdoor musical production of Big River, set along the banks of the Quinebaug River. As Vice President for Strategic Initiatives, Marketing, and Policy at Bette Midler's nonprofit New York Restoration Project, Darin co-conceived and led Million Trees NYC, a citywide public-private partnership between Mayor Michael Bloomberg and the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. From 2004 to 2006, Darin served as National Public Relations Director for Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, where he directed national and local public relations strategies for 3 touring units of the circus, and created and launched Circus Fit, a national youth fitness program and curriculum in partnership with the President's Council on Physical Fitness and Sports and the National Association of Sports and Physical Education. Darin holds a Master of Arts in Government Affairs and Issues Management from George Washington University, from the Graduate School of Political Management, and a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Musical Theater from Millikan University. Some of you I know, I think, attended Darin's excellent talk earlier this summer about Tony Sarg and all the research he had done. I'm still hearing great things about that night and that talk, Darin. It was really great. And it has really been a pleasure for me to get to know Darin and get to work with him, and very grateful for the work you've done and some of the things we're talking about going forward. So with that, Darin.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you for having me here tonight. And I especially want to point out one of the board members for my theater company is here with us tonight and is a resident of Nantucket. So Jan Shaw and her husband Sig are here tonight. So I want to thank them for hosting me while I'm on Nantucket. So you heard a little bit about my background, but as a kid, I had 3 passions. Going to the circus, going to the theater, and puppetry. And as a kid, my parents, I was very fortunate. I grew up in a small rural farm town about an hour and a half from Chicago, and I had parents that weren't afraid of the big city, and so they would take us to Chicago and we'd see touring Broadway shows. We'd every year go and see Ringling Brothers Circus, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then I had a puppet theater that I would take up to our local nursing home with my wagon and put on a puppet show for a very captive audience. So as I got older, I decided I wanted to do something in each of those 3 passion areas. And so I pursued theater as a youth and ended up getting my undergraduate in musical theater and directing, and performed in community theater and professional theater. And then my senior year in college, I decided I didn't have what it took to go to Broadway, so I got my master's degree in public policy. And that maybe a decade later, the stars aligned, and I got to go work for Ringling Brothers Circus, and I headed up public relations for the 3 circus units, and it was an incredible journey, and I learned so much. But I had done that, and then I kind of got out of that field and had never done puppetry, and that was the one area that I always had a real passion for, because growing up I had watched Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers, and there was a show that was based out of the UK called The Thunderbirds, which I think is one of the most amazing puppet shows, and also The Muppets, right? And so I decided, when I decided to leave Sturbridge Village, that I wanted to dedicate the rest of my professional career helping to advance an art form. And so I spent a year just researching puppetry and talking to stakeholders and leaders in the puppetry community, experts, to learn about it. And a gentleman that I was quickly introduced to, his name is Philip Huber, and he is the best marionette puppeteer in America. You've seen his work if you saw the movie Being John Malkovich. He did all of the puppetry work in that movie. And Philip has toured the world with his cabaret marionette shows. And we quickly became friends, partly because he grew up in a small rural town in Illinois as well. And I shared with him that my favorite puppeteer was a gentleman by the name of Bill Baird. And Bill Baird had an incredible marionette theater at 59 Barrow Street in New York City in the Village for a decade and a half. And his craftsmanship was incredible. He would tap Broadway playwrights, lyricists, and composers and just put on these incredible shows. And Bill was also really the first person that brought puppetry to television and film. And so when I shared that with Philip, he said, well, Darin, if you love Bill Baird, you have to know who taught Bill Baird, and that was Tony Sarg. And so he encouraged me to buy Tony's book, which was written in 1921. It was really the first how-to book for anybody that kind of gave away all the trade secrets on puppetry. And you'll soon find out, I'm sure, both of us here, when we get into something, we quickly go down the rabbit hole, which I tend to do very quickly on any subject. And so as I read this book, I decided I wanted to learn everything there was about this guy, and then started going on eBay and buying Tony Sarg posters and programs, initially just things related to puppetry. But as I got involved with the Norman Rockwell Museum, I decided I wanted to expand my collection and my knowledge about him. And it's interesting what happened with Norman Rockwell. So I have a home about 20 minutes from the Norman Rockwell Museum, and my theater company is developing 3 different puppet-centric productions. And the second one that we are working on is a marionette show about a very famous illustrator named Will James, who actually lived just kind of a little like at the back end of Tony Sarg's life. But Will James was a real American cowboy who, kind of like Sarg, started out as an illustrator as a kid and would just illustrate for the fun of it, never went to formal art school. And Will James had lived this cowboy life, like a real cowboy life, like wrangling cattle, and had an accident because he went out to San Francisco to do stunt riding for the movies, and he had an accident, fell on railroad tracks, and couldn't be a cowboy anymore. And so his wife encouraged him to pursue his illustrating career, and he ended up then starting to write short stories about being a cowboy, which were picked up by Scribners, and then he wrote his first book, which was Smokey the Cowhorse, which won number of prizes and was turned into a motion picture 3 times. It was so popular. So he ended up writing 24 novels for young adults about the American West and would do all those illustrations. So we're creating a show about him. And I went to the reason I found out about Will James, I went to an art museum in Scottsdale, Arizona, that's dedicated to cowboy and Native American art. And they had all of his, it was the last day of the exhibition, and I went and saw these illustrations of Will James, and there was so much action in the illustrations that it just leapt from the page, and it naturally said to me, this has to be a show. Like, I want to do something with this. And so started developing this project, and because he was an illustrator and I saw this exhibition, I went to the Norman Rockwell Museum to pitch them on the idea of bringing that exhibition there and then putting a tent on the grounds and doing a puppet show about Will James. And they're like, and I wanted to do it very quickly, and they're like, no, we plan our exhibitions five years out. By the way, have you ever heard of this guy, Tony Sarg? And I'm like, what? And they're like, we're gonna do an exhibition on him. I'm like, well, yeah, I know a lot about him. And so out of that, then I got involved like George in helping them, and I did a lot in terms of finding all of the marionettes that were privately held around the country that could be in the exhibition, as well as kind of helping them with all of the parts that are specifically around puppetry. So that's kind of how all that happened for me.
So you mentioned, going down the rabbit hole and all the research, and I think that's a common thing I hear from collectors who get bitten by the bug, and now they're going to look everywhere they can, do all the research they can, and find out. Which I think has got to be one of the great appeals about being a collector, to really, turn over every stone and find what you can. Were you bitten at an early age? I'm going to ask both of you the same question. By the collecting bug? Or George, for you, was it really, as you mentioned, in 1983, you came to the island and decided you needed to find something to collect?
Well, I guess I've been a collector most of my life of one thing or another. Collector of people, who I bounce and get a lot of information from, but of objects. Yes, I've had objects that have come in. I think the first thing I ever bought was that as a college student, I was in New York City and Greenwich Village for an outdoor art festival. And I didn't have a pot to piss in, so to speak. But there was somebody there selling something, and it was $10, and I said, I love that. And I bought it, my first piece of art. And it continued. You buy things that you like. You get your first apartment. You want things that you like, whether it's three-dimensional or two-dimensional, and they become part of you. And I think that's what started my collecting. My collecting changed when I bought a shop, and even prior to my shop, I was realizing that I was making more money buying and selling than on my day job, for which I was highly educated, but not getting highly educated prices as they would today. And I decided, well, I'm out of work. I have a pension that I could vest. Why don't I go into something else? So that collecting became different because I was collecting, but I was buying it to also sell. And that's a different kind of thing of just buying because you love it. But I also never bought anything that I didn't love in the first place. Because if I didn't love it, I couldn't sell it. And also it became very interesting with Sarg. When I came here, I realized Nina Hellman, who had a shop next to me, had Sarg. Linda Willauer had Sarg. At that time, I'm trying to think who was the dealer that was behind the Whaling Museum in the old Denby building.
Paul Madden?
Pardon?
Paul Madden?
Paul Madden had Sarg. We all had Sarg. And I remember one time, in the early days of eBay, I was bidding on something on eBay, and I knew Nina Hellman's name, but that she went by. We all had a code name, but I had quickly figured out who her name was. And I said, Nina and I are bidding on the same object. It was a watercolor, The Blind Accordion Player. And I forget, but it was like at $125 or $150, but we were the only bidders. I called Nina, I said, Nina, you probably know my name, and I know yours. We're bidding on that same Sarg object. I think that's a very poor idea. I mean, we can both buy it, outbid it, and then we'll sell it too. We have collectors, we can easily sell it. But I have a better idea. Why don't we keep the price low? We buy it, and together, you and Bob, and at that time, myself and my husband Richard, will give it to the NHA. And that's what we did, and it's in the exhibit upstairs. I thought, well, that was the best way to handle that. So we bought it and gave it. And I think that's what happens to many, many collectors. And it goes back to Beinecke right here, the Beinecke Rare Book Library. It goes back to the Whitneys, the Vanderbilts, the Morgan Library in New York. We buy things, and we are really temporary custodians of objects. because these objects are not going to die with us. We want to pass them on. Now, whether we pass them on within the family or we give them to some place else, but many, many times these objects then become part of collections, public collections, museums and libraries. And I strongly feel that way, and I'm strongly feeling that way today of the things that I still have, but as I'm aging and I have no heirs, I want to give these things to organizations like the NHA. I said to Niles the other day, I said, you know, at the end of this exhibition, you're going to have things to return to me, but we should have a discussion because I don't want them all returned.
Megan, did you hear that?
I don't want them all returned. Some of these things should stay at the NHA. And you can keep them, but I give it to you this year, next year, the following year, however it works financially and with the IRS. But keep them in your possession, and we'll gradually put them into the collection. Not everything, but quite a few things, because that's where I think they should be.
Well, we're very grateful, George, and you have, over the last 30 years, really contributed to the Tony Sarg collection in many, many ways. And
I know.
I do want to come back to that line of thinking.
Well,
though.
when I was selling my house here in 2018, I said, Michael, come up and come down to the basement with me before I start packing these things. There's a bunch of Sarg material that I think maybe you should look at. What do you want? And I think we came up with 50 or 60 things that he said, I'd like to have all these. I said, consider them yours.
Really amazing. I do want to come back to your larger point, sort of towards the end, if we could, and touch on sort of long-range vision for collectors. But Darin, early collector, bitten by the bug as a young boy, and sort of following George's lead, what was the first Tony Sarg piece that you acquired?
Yes.
If you remember.
So I actually hadn't really thought about myself as a collector until we spoke with you to prep for this thing. And I was thinking back, and I have a great story to tell. I mentioned about Ringling Brothers. So when I had never been to the circus, and I was 9 years old, and I had gone up to our town of 900 people, and in our supermarket, you walked in, and there was this giant 3-foot by 5-foot giant Ringling Brothers poster advertising that it was coming to the Chicago International Amphitheater in November. And I was excited because of the illustration, right? I had never seen something like that before, and they were having a drawing. And they were you could put your name in, and they were giving away tickets. And so I entered, and then about a week later, 2 weeks later, we had gone to a town called Ottawa, Illinois, which is about a half an hour from where I grew up, in a larger town, and they have a Walgreens there. And they were having a coloring contest to win VIP tickets to the circus. And so I grabbed one of the sheets and went home and colored it in and entered the coloring contest. And a couple weeks later, I found out that I won both contests. And so my family got in our station wagon and went to Chicago, and I experienced Ringling Brothers for the first time, and I had seen nothing like it. And so when I came back from that experience, I went up to the Uhas's grocery store and asked Mr. Uhas if I could have that poster. And I kept it all those years, and it's now in my hallway in New York City. And that's where it was born, because what I will tell you is, after that moment, my entire bedroom became circus. I had Ringling Brothers curtains and bedspreads. I had bookcases that I painted red, and my father loved going to auctions and antique shows. And so I would buy old circus programs and circus figurines and circus costumes and everything imaginable. And as I now think about this, my room was a little miniature circus museum. And that's really where it started. And I would say the other piece of what inspired me to be a collector was, as a child, I think starting in kindergarten or first grade, we had something called show and tell. where you would bring an object and you would tell your classmates about that object. And so for me, the magic of collecting is storytelling. Some of the most valuable pieces that I have didn't cost a lot, and they're not worth a lot money-wise, but they're worth a lot because they have a story behind it and some type of personal meaning. And so you ask about the first Sarg piece. So, you know, when Philip Huber told me that I had to go and buy on eBay one of Tony Sarg's original, or one of his books that was written in 1921, I bought one, right? But then the rabbit hole started, and I needed to have a first edition, and I needed to have one that, let me see here, that actually had a hand illustration in it. So I got that at a bookstore in New York. I found that, and so that, I consider this kind of my first Tony Sarg piece that I got, which was pretty exciting.
Love it. This question's probably like asking which is your favorite child that, you know, people ask sometimes. But do you have a favorite Sarg artifact that you've collected? Does one just come to mind that's it?
I do, but will you first tell them about your first Sarg piece, the dump?
Oh, the story about the dump?
The map.
The map.
Oh, yeah.
It was maybe not my first Sarg piece, but probably the first Sarg piece that I have that is the map. Yep. It has the most interesting provenance. Remember when the dump was the dump? And there was a hill, and you could walk up on the hill, and you would trip over things, but you would pick up wood for your wood-burning stove. You would pick up whatever was there. Well, I went up on the hill.
So this was not the take it or leave it. This was the actual hill.
This was the hill,
dump.
way before take it or leave it. I mean, this was just the hill.
Got it.
And not the steamroller, but the bulldozer was on the top burying things as people would bring things in, and it came and it went. Well, on the hill was a copy of that map. And I went over to it, and I went to put my hand down on it, and another hand got to it before me. And I looked up at this fellow, and I said, "I'll give you $10 for it." And he said, "Okay." So I gave him $10 at the dump because his hand got to the object before I did. It was not in good condition, and I took it back to a restorer, and I think I paid like $200 to get it restored. But it was one of the original maps, and it came out beautifully. And it was, again, I felt compelled to get it restored. And I just think it was a very unusual way to acquire things, that it was free, but it wasn't free.
Love it. Darin?
So in terms of my favorite Sarg pieces, there's probably two. One I recently acquired, I guess maybe a year ago, on an auction, online auction. And it is, let's see here. It's this painting, and this was done in 1941. And what's interesting about this Sarg painting is that Sarg would go out and do kind of speaking tour. And so he would go out to press clubs and other types of venues like the YMCAs or business clubs and stuff and do speeches about his life and career. But while he was speaking, he would paint or draw. So this one was done at the Inland Empire Press Club out in California in 1941. So he would have painted this while he was doing his kind of speaking engagement to the press club. The second piece, we're 95% sure that it's Sarg, but we haven't found photos to make it definitely. But Philip Huber, who I mentioned earlier, he restores. So I'll talk a little bit later, but I also collect a lot of historic puppets, and he does a lot of my restoration work for me. A couple years ago, there was a a knight on a horse marionette that was falling apart. All the pieces were there, but the arm was broken off and whatnot. And I bought it because something in my head, there was something in the face of the marionette that ringed familiar to me. And so I bought it and sent it to Philip, and he restored it, and he's 95% sure. We've actually seen a horse hanging from Tony Sarg's in his studio in Greenwich Village that almost is the identical horse. So he's pretty sure the horse is Tony Sarg, but we're not sure 100% if the marionette. But this is what it looked like when I got him. And this is what he looked like after we restored him. And I have to laugh about George saying about $200 to do restoration, right? So as collectors, you always find things that you think you got a good deal on, right? But then you forget you either have to restore the marionette or you have to have something framed, and forget about all those, extra costs on top of just buying the item. So
those are examples of ones you've landed. Do either of you have, one Sarg piece that's out there that is out there that you'd love to find someday? Do you have a great white whale that you haven't landed yet? Sarg.
Regarding Sarg?
Sarg particularly. Or I guess it could be anything, but
well, as
Sarg.
far as Sarg, there's a huge there's so much already here in the NHA, so much of which is not included in this exhibition. And I know for a fact of how much is in that up at the Gosnell Center,
right,
because it was one year that I was up at the Gosnell Center, and I don't remember whether you or who was the person within the NHA that let me go into the Gosnell Center on my own to do research, and I was pulling open drawers and this and that and the other thing, and I went to leave. I was locked in at the Gosnell Center.
Gosnell Center, for those of you who don't know, is our storage facility where we have most of our artifact collection housed.
I was into an area that I was locked into, this storage area, but I couldn't get out, and everybody had gone. I'm glad I had a cell phone at that time, and somebody came by and finally got me. But going in there and looking in drawers and seeing things, there's a book that the NHA has that is, I think it's 99% complete, that Sarg never published. But to do it today would be not politically correct whatsoever. You never know where you're going to find something. I was raised in a family where at dinner time, a question came up, well, the encyclopedia's over there. And before you know it, you'd have a discussion and you'd learn something. You learned an awful lot. Intellectual curiosity came together. Today, it's so easy. We're reading the New York Times in the morning. In the New York Times, there's always a word, and every day you come up with, I never heard of that word before. And now you can just put your finger on that word and you highlight it, and you get the definition. And you go back to the article. But intellectual curiosity is, as you find something, and when I was doing for my shop, I had labels for everything. It wasn't just having an object, but I had labels like I was taught to do in a museum that gave you information. When I did the Nantucket Antique Show, the same way. In my booth, I would have a label that would tell you, what is this object? And out of that object, I learned an awful lot. Because as you would do it, it was like, with Google today, fantastic. Let's see, I didn't know that particular aspect of an object. And it's so much fun to collect, but it's so much fun to learn. I'm not young anymore, but I hope I'm not haven't stopped learning. Every day you learn something new.
One that got away or you haven't landed yet?
Yeah, so I would say two things, like dreams would be, one is to like own a Sarg, like a true Sarg. Like this we think likely is, but to have a true Sarg marionette I think would be pretty amazing. There's only a few left with private collectors. Most of the ones that are here came from the Northwest Puppetry Center, from Dimitri Carter, who was given them through the Alan Cook collection. Alan Cook was one of the foremost puppet collectors in America, who passed away a number of years ago, and donated his collection to the Northwest Center. And then the second collection was the Gary Buss collection out of Texas. And that collection was donated to the Dallas Puppet Theater, and a couple of their marionettes are also in this exhibition. But yeah, very few are in private hands. I also would love, and not even if I got it, but it'd be incredible if there was actually parts of an original Sarg balloon from the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. But like George, it's not only collecting objects, it's collecting knowledge, because some of the things, as I've been involved in this exhibition, there's some real gaps of information about Sarg's life, right? Like getting into the real weeds about things in that he experienced over his career. And so when I was here for my keynote lecture in June, I was talking with Michael, the curator, and we started having this conversation about there's not a lot known about where Tony Sarg lived, right? So I went home and went down that rabbit hole, and what I found out was in 1920, so we knew that Tony Sarg and his family lived in New Jersey, even though he mostly worked in New York City. So in 1920, I found census documents. Him and his wife lived in this apartment building in Orange, New Jersey. And then shortly after, and for quite a while, they lived in this little Cape Cod in Bloomfield, New Jersey, and were there for a while. And then he would occasionally stay in 54 West 9th Street, which was it was headquarters of the Tony Sarg Marionette Theater. So they had a build workshop on the first floor and also in the basement. And that second floor there with the balcony, that was where he had his illustrating table so he could get light in and would do all of his drawings. And then in the back half of the townhouse on his floor, he had stored all of his like favorite marionettes and puppets. And then there was more storage upstairs. And that's now a private residence in New York. But what was really interesting is before he passed away in 1940, this amazing place, which is no longer there, but very kind of bohemian New Orleans, it was this artist kind of co-op colony that was down in the West Village, and this was his last address in New York City. So that was crazy to be able to find just through census records and stuff. And then a lot of us had never seen what his wife looked like. And I happened to come across their passport photos. And so this is in 1924, Sarg was 43 years old, and that's Bertha, or Bert, they called her, and then that's Mary Sarg, his daughter, and she would have been 12 years old. So I love exploring new, we know that his first office in New York City was on the first floor, on the top floor of the Flatiron Building. Like, I want to know, we don't really know how long he was in the Flatiron Building. We don't know what office he had in the Flatiron Building. And those are things that, through public records or the historical associations in New York, we can find those things out. And, the other thing we really don't know about Sarg is 100% is why he went bankrupt. Like, we know that he invested a lot of his own money in producing merchandise to sell at the New York World's Fair in '39, and we don't believe that he got the return on his investment from that. And I'll actually show you one piece, speaking of that, for the world's...
He went bankrupt because of
Well, he did.
He went bankrupt because of over-investing with all that merchandise.
Oh, absolutely. But there's also thought that there were other things going on, that he had invested in other things, but nobody has like his accounting books, right? But for the World's Fair, one of the products that he designed, he was tapped by a fabric company to make Tony Sarg design fabric. And this literally happened 2 weeks ago. This came up on eBay and nobody bid against me. I was shocked. So I got these for like $29 each. Literally, they look like they're brand new. But these are swatch samples of Tony Sarg fabric from the 1939 World's Fair, and showing all the different colors you could get. And I just found these on eBay, which is crazy.
Great find.
Yeah, and the other thing that I wanted to quickly show you, which I have never seen this, maybe George you have, but again, a couple months ago, I randomly found these on eBay. But there's a set of cigarette holder and women's compact, but these are sterling silver cases, and engraved, and you can come up here afterwards, engraved is a city street map of New York designed by Tony Sarg with little jewels on it. And I found these, they were all scratched up, so I bought them and took them to the Diamond District in New York, and there's a place that polished them all up for me, and they look like they're brand new. But I had never seen these before.
There are many Sarg things that which are not included upstairs. He designed barber shops where the stools, the chairs, which were designed for children to be on, it was like a carousel horse or something. But he designed those so children were not threatened by going to the barber shop. He designed, where was it? Where I was going something else. Oh, he designed interiors of restaurants. There's a restaurant in Greenwich Village that he did. Of course, upstairs there is documentation about what he did for the Oasis room in the Waldorf Astoria, including all the murals on the wall and the cocktail napkins. He did the whole thing, just as architects and designers do today, say, at the Seagram's building, the way it was when it was first done by Philip Johnson. It wasn't just the Rothko murals that were in there, but it was carried through to so many of the other objects that were in the Four Seasons restaurant at that time. I had a phone call on my cell phone when we were driving north a few years ago from Key West up to Nantucket, and it was someone, the fellows who do the television show American Pickers, and they found me, evidently, by going to Google, but they found me because if you do Sarg, Korn often comes up, and they had found, and I have never seen these, and I never saw the program, but these big lanterns that they found somewhere in the Midwest, and they had Sarg on them, but they didn't know what they were. Well, I'm not sure because actually I never saw the whole program, but it sounded like they were great big paper lanterns that were done for something.
It was a paper elephant. I've seen pictures of them.
I mean,
they're incredible.
so,
I think there's one. Yeah.
So, is there something still out there? Sure.
Clearly, yeah.
Sure. You just found those fabric swatches. There's other fabric swatches here at the NHA of fabric that was never done, and yet there was many fabrics that were done, and there's some upstairs. It's a fascinating thing to be a collector.
So as a collector and sort of in the art world, certain things seem to have a popularity cycle in terms of collecting. You know, furniture's up now, or, you know, now and then, and then ebbs, certain artists, you know, and so forth. Have you noticed that with Sarg? Has there been ebbs and flows with his popularity? Where do you see it sort of going now? Do you think the renewed attention because of the exhibition, the catalog, and so forth will have an effect?
I would certainly imagine that between this show being at the Rockwell and now here, and with the publicity that's been done, there was a very long, lengthy article in that the curators at the Rockwell wrote for I forget, the American Artist magazine. It was a national magazine. I forget which one it was. And all these things create interest. And hopefully people will become more and more interested and curious and want to do things, want to know more. And hopefully that it would be very nice if either the New York Historical Society picked up on this and would do a version of it, since the New York Historical Society is where they inflate the balloons for the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. And of course, he had a huge influence in New York. So the New York Historical Society is certainly a venue that would be appropriate. The Victoria and Albert in London, I have been there. They have a number of Sarg pieces. The London Transportation Museum has all the broadsides that he had done for the underground in the about 1910 or 15. I've been there, I've seen them, they're huge. And I mean, this is a whole other area where it would be wonderful for them to explore it on their end, but incorporate things from this end. It's just, he's a phenomenal presence that is worldwide and has crossed so many social barriers. I mean, he was just phenomenal.
Well, I was talking to Niles about this the other night is, one of the things that happens is when you have somebody like Tony Sarg, right? Like his daughter passed away, she didn't have children, so he didn't have someone in his lineage to keep his legacy alive, right? Where it's very different with someone like Walt Disney, and there's a Disney Family Foundation and stuff. So, I think this has been incredible that so many people have been exposed to Tony Sarg at the Norman Rockwell and now here at the NHA. But what I was saying to Niles is, how do we build on this exhibition? Because the exhibition's just a finite time, right? But the book does that a little bit, but we also live in a very computer technology age. And so one of the things I was talking to Niles is I'm interested in now kind of taking this momentum and, how do we build a Tony Sarg website that could really be like an encyclopedia of Tony Sarg and brings his career to life through a virtual timeline or videos? Or do we look at eventually developing an hour-long documentary? Could we do that in time that it can coincide? Because in 2 years is the 100th anniversary of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. We are going to be having some conversations with, some of the museums in New York to see if there might be a way to mount this exhibition or a smaller pop-up version of it to coincide with that anniversary. But I do think that there will be, because of these exhibitions and because of that anniversary, and there'll be a lot of, I think, talk about Sarg and his impact, not only on the parade, but if you don't know this, is Sarg also was tapped first, before the balloons, was tapped in 1924 to create mechanical holiday windows for Macy's, which started a whole new tradition of holiday animated windows in all of the department stores in New York. So I do think there's interest in that. The other thing I want to just say, following up on what you were talking about, is, what's interesting about Sarg is, one, he was a branding genius. Everything that he made had his name on it, whether it was the Tony Sarg marionettes, his traveling theater company, if it was his linens or his napkins, if it was the Tony Sarg Oasis Room at the Waldorf. He understood branding and the power of his name, which I think is incredible. And I think the other thing is, and I was sharing this with Jan and Sig today, he was Walt Disney before Walt Disney. Like, he was making stop motion animated shorts 3 years before Walt Disney did it. So again, this is one of those knowledge things that I want to find out is, what impact did Sarg have? Did he really have an impact on the trajectory of Walt Disney? I actually think he probably did. And so
I agree on that. If Sarg had lived longer, I think he would have had much more of an impact as Disney has had. He was in that same realm, and just too bad that he died. He was 1880. He was 64. I don't know how long Walt Disney lived, but anyway.
I'm mindful of the time. I want to make sure we have a chance for the audience to ask questions. But I did want to ask one more question that kind of gets back at what you were talking about earlier, George, in terms of ultimately what do you think you want to do with your collection? I wanted to pose that to both of you in sort of the larger context of why do you collect? And you've already talked about that quite a bit, the thrill of the hunt and the research and the learning and going down the rabbit hole. But do you live with your collections? Is that part of why you collect, so you're surrounded by them? And then ultimately, at some point, you do ask the question, what becomes of the work I've done in my collection? How do I want that to live going forward?
In my case, I have no heirs. So therefore, I either sell it because I need the money, or I give it away. And I think it might be a combination of the two things. For people that have collections and pass away, if they have a family, then there's a family feud of, do we keep it? Do we divide it? Do we sell it? And we see that all the time with the auctions in New York, whether it's at Sotheby's or it's at Christie's or anywhere else in the world. Pieces come up and they're sold for those various reasons. It's been given to a family of 3 children. Well, there's one object and you can't cut it into 3 pieces, therefore they sell it. Whether the people want to give it to an organization, to a museum, where David Rockefeller gave most of his collection to the Museum of Modern Art. There's many things, happen in different ways, but I guess it is, things are disposed of for the 3 Ds: death, divorce, or debt. And that's the reason why many things go out into the world, because of those 3 things. They can't be divided. People need the money, or you got to settle an estate or a marriage or whatever.
Darin, do you live with your objects? Do you have them on? You talked about framing them and.
Yeah. So yes, I have everything in our house, both in New York and upstate. And I not only collect Sarg, obviously I collect puppets, right? And one of the joys I find in that is most of the puppets, historical puppets that I purchase, and only made by American puppeteers, need major restoration, right? So as I said earlier, you pay a couple $100 for a old marionette, and then you spend $800 or $1,000 to have it restored. But I feel like I'm saving things, and I know for my collections, I've told you my Sarg stuff will someday come here, and my puppet collections will be divided among some of the puppet museums around the country. I also collect shaker. I'm a big shaker collector and historian, and my things will go to the shaker museums. So I feel a duty and kind of pride in being able, I'm fortunate enough to have resources to do that and restore things. And so I feel this responsibility to take care of them, to make them better, to make sure they're safely kept, and then to be able to someday share them. And the other thing I thought was awesome is, in the Norman Rockwell Museum, I didn't even think about this. They came to me and said, would you loan some of your objects for the exhibition? It didn't even take me a second to say yes, because again, I'm fortunate to have those things and be their steward right now, but to be able to share those, because unfortunately there are some collectors in the world that keep all their stuff under lock and key and don't share it with anybody. I have it all around my house because, as I said to you, coming full circle, for me it's show and tell. So when we have house guests or people come over or have dinner parties, I take people around and I have all these stories. I just bought this. I collect a little bit of Disney stuff, and there's a place called it's called the smallest museum, I think smallest museum in the world. And I just bought, it's probably this big, a piece of carpet from Walt Disney's original apartment at Disneyland, right? But it's cool. He stepped on it at one time. But I get to bring somebody up. It's in my bedroom on my desk, and I talk about that. And I have my desk. I can't use my desk because it is full of probably 75 or 80 things, and I can tell a story about the Civil War bullet, this piece, because I love it, because it allows me to be a storyteller.
Yeah, that's show and tell.
Show and tell.
That you hard as a youngster.
And my husband has said to me, if you don't deal with these objects that you have while you're physically and mentally competent, you're being irresponsible. So under his guidance, I have gone through my collections, my objects, and I'm not complete yet, but many of those things have tags, identification. This is what should happen. This piece should be given to this museum. This piece should be given to somebody else. This piece should be given to a family member, or whatever. I'm trying to go through that and directing where these objects going, and most of them going out into the world. Because as I said, I am a temporary custodian, and I want to be responsible for what happens to them after I die, and give the guidance that I know to have that happen.
And Niles, can I just share, yesterday I had lunch with a very respected collector from Nantucket who said to me, collecting is a disease, right? Because once you get it, you can't stop, right? It is a disease. And just a funny story, because I always think, my husband is not a collector. He's an architect, and he's a minimalist, right? Our house would have nothing in it if it was up to him. And so there's that balance, right? And I have always, this is a great story, and I'll end on this one. Great story. Anytime I make a purchase, big or small, I always talk to Greg, and we have to both be okay with it, right? And about a month or two ago, because of circus, I'm obsessed my whole life with miniature circuses. And one came up for auction, and I didn't talk to him about it. And I went ahead and bought it, and the next day I had to return it.
Oh, boy.
What happened the next day?
I had to return it.
Oh.
But it is funny, the journey that a spouse has to take with a collector, because they might not share the same passion for Tony Sarg or circus or puppetry or all these things. And so the spouse is always, I think, is very thoughtful to allow those of us who have that passion to collect to have patience for it, and also celebrate with us, because when we get something, it's a victory, right? When we get it and it's a trophy, and to celebrate with us. And so that's, yeah.
Well, I want to turn it open to the audience, but did just want to acknowledge to both of you, thank you very much for what you have already talked about, promising the NHA, and that thinking that you just described, George, which I know is not easy, and I wish everybody had that. It's not universally shared, I think, but that you do, and that you've gone to that trouble and the extent to think about that, and that I know that, as both of you have said, some of it is coming here ultimately means the world to us, and so thank you very much. And so I'd love to open it up to the crowd. If any questions, Paul, yes.
Linda and I have been collecting probably for 30 years, primarily in the porcelain area, but we collect pictures and things of that sort. And we had a friend of ours who also collected porcelain in New York City, and he made the comment, he said, I'm giving some of my porcelain away. He said, but I'm not giving it all away. He said, if everything ends up in museums, there is going to be nothing for collectors to buy. And perhaps with that in mind, you might hold things back or put things back on the market so that people do have things to purchase. What are your thoughts about that?
Oh, well, I agree, because there's a number of things that I have, and I have them that these should go to this auction house or to that auction house, because I think that having dealt with various auction houses, these items would fit into that auction house and be more for a collector than being a major piece for a museum that would fill in a specific spot in their collection. If it's something that a museum wants because it fills in a void, then I feel that's where it should go. If it's something that's part of their general collection, we have other examples of this particular work, then I think it should go out into the field for the new collectors coming up so they get the bug.
Because certainly the fear is that you donate all these items and they end up in the depot of the museum and they're never never being shown.
So that's a little bit what has happened in the puppetry world, right? So there were two major collectors. You know, the heyday of puppetry in America was from the 1920s until like early 1960s, right? Until television came into play. And there were some great American puppeteers. There were a few collectors, two that I mentioned tonight, who basically hoarded everything, right? And then their collections were donated to not-for-profits. And so entire decades of puppetry completely went off the market. And the other, talking about things, collections being stored, right, is the problem is now is that we have, you know, the Center for Puppetry Arts in Atlanta, which has a great exhibition, but most of it is focused on television puppetry and the Muppets, because the Hensons built a beautiful annex there. But the vast majority of their collection is sitting in boxes, right? And then you have the University of Connecticut that has the only degree puppetry program left in the United States. They have about 5,000 to 6,000 puppets in their collection. They have a very tiny museum in Storrs, Connecticut, that maybe 5 people go in a day, and it's only open 3 days a week. So no one sees the majority of their collection. And then Bill Baird, this is the craziest part, Bill Baird's collection, half of it was sold at auction and actually went to collectors, which is great because there's a lot of Bill Baird in the collector world. And then the other half went to the McNider Art Museum in Iowa and it's a fine art museum, but they had done, while Bill was alive, they had done an exhibition on Bill's work, and Bill and the director of the museum became good friends. And so before Bill died, he gave the best of his collection, or best of his puppets, including all of the characters from The Sound of Music, the movie, to the McNider. And so they have about 500 of those marionettes. They have 100 up a year. The rest of them are sitting in boxes. I've talked to the curator. Most of them are falling apart because a lot of the material that these puppets were made, they weren't made to last forever, right? And so no one is seeing those. And then they're at the McNider, and she said if 10 people a year come specifically to see those puppets, that's like a lot. So I do think this idea, and I haven't thought about that, is the idea that it is important to also, while we want things shown in museums, we also want to be able to have people continue to have this passion for collection, because a lot of the things that are restored are actually done oftentimes by private collectors like myself. So I think that's an excellent point.
And there's one other thing too. When one wants to donate something to a museum, most museums have collections committees. And you can offer it to a museum, and they will say, on condition, we would like to have this on condition of going through our collections committee. And I recently wanted to give a piece to the museum in Doylestown, I can't think right now, But anyway, they decided they did not want to have that piece because although it fit into their collection, they do not collect textiles. And they had no way to, they didn't think that they wanted it because they had no way to preserve it. That's something that they did not have within the museum itself. And they said, no, it should go to another museum that has a textile department.
Mike?
Two very quick comments. One is not just for Sarg, but all three of you are preserving the culture, and I think that's incredible, okay? Because that's at the top of what you're all talking about. The other is, Judy and I love Turner Classic movies, and one of our favorite movies is Night at the Waldorf. And there's a scene in Night at the Waldorf where they're walking into the Waldorf restaurant, and there's a pan of Tony Sarg's murals from the beginning to the end, following the characters as they walk through the restaurant. I have a clip of it if you want it.
George, the book that you said was never published, and today it probably wouldn't be appropriate. The book that, the Tony Sarg book that was never published?
Right.
And what wouldn't be appropriate?
Because it was, if I'm correct, it's in the museum collection. I saw it years ago, but it was treating the black audience in terms that would not be politically correct today, referring to black people with the word like coon and that kind of word that was in the way that Sarg had. And as we all know, as we have matured, words are not politically correct today, and that book would not fly if it was published. It's better left, in my mind, in the collection for research purposes, but it doesn't need to be published and distributed. It's just, it's not appropriate today.
Well, and it's interesting because I actually just acquired a marionette that was deconcessioned. Is that right? Is that the right word? Deaccessioned from a museum / not-for-profit of a marionette that was created by Frank Paris. And Frank Paris lived in New York on Gay Street. He was openly a gay puppeteer in the 30s, 40s, and he actually created the original Howdy Doody character. And this marionette that he created was from a circus marionette show that he had created. But the character is kind of exaggerated blackface, something that that museum, a puppetry museum, wouldn't feel comfortable presenting. I acquired it, but I have a different feeling about it because I then contacted the African American Museum in Washington, D.C., because sometimes museums have done exhibits about how African American people were wrongly portrayed in our history, and that this could be an example of that. And so I think there is potentially an opportunity for it to be showcased in an exhibit in the right context.
Context is everything there, I think. I just wanted to mention, we did take one of his books in our collection and republish it and print it. It was a collection of children's stories from 6 to 60 and published in part of that as a reprint this year coming out.
Have you ever been to the Big Apple Circus?
Many, many times.
Okay.
Other questions?
Good evening to the panel. We are Jocelyn Wong's grandparents. I'd like to thank the panel for a very well presented document, and especially giving us the opportunity what is whaling about. We never were taught about this at school, so it's like the Chinese yin and the yang, the haves and the have-nots. So the haves, with your knowledge, giving back into society and hoping the future generation will actually know more about whaling than us. A question, the early whalemen, were there any people of color, or was it just mostly the settlers?
No, from the beginning, Nantucket, those who went whaling from Nantucket were really quite diverse, including Wampanoag, Native American population here on the island, as well as people from all over the United States, as well as other countries, the Azores, Cape Verde, and so on. It was really quite a diverse population aboard the ships. Yeah, and I'm glad you were able to visit the island. Welcome. Yeah. If no other questions, again, it's just a treat that this happened. And George, I know going back 25 years, and you've been at it longer than that, but to get the exhibit here and to get the publication and to have you here and talking is really a thrill. It means a lot. So thank you. And Darin, for many of our conversations in recent months and what I look forward to ahead, some exciting times. So thank you both for coming tonight, for your work on this exhibit, on the catalog, and as I said before, for your generosity in helping build the collection here at the NHA. We're very grateful.
And I can only interject one other thing is I have met Darin during this process. He researched me out about 4 or 5 years ago when I was renting a house in the Berkshires, and he had his house only a few miles away, and we got together, and since then we have bonded. The other thing is I could be Darin's father. So the age difference of Darin's excitement about acquiring right now, I'm more interested in giving it away. I'm not acquiring much anymore.
Well, and
That's
Pardon?
right.
I'm de-accessioning. I can't say I'm completely de-accessioning because every once in a while I say, oh, I've got to have that.
Well, and I would just end by saying that's been the cool thing about being involved with this exhibition is I have met George, I've met Niles, the staff here, the folks at Norman Rockwell Museum, and it's this, we all share a passion for history, and not only for history, but how history can guide us forward. And we've created these great friendships, we've thought about new partnerships and stuff, so I just think a lot of good things have come out of this on top of just celebrating Sarg, so.
This has nothing to do with Sarg, but I have been involved with the NHA for many, many, many years. And I remember when this museum was opening. When did this open?
2005.
2005. And it was sort of like, this is opening to the public in 3 or 4 days. And Richard, my first husband, and I were up in the Scrimshaw Gallery. It was such a joy. We were placing things and putting them up and placing labels and holding on to them. It was a real treat just to be part of that, because you can all look at it now, but just putting it in my hands, and that was a real treat.
It was all hands on deck to get that.
Oh, it was
open.
all hands on deck then, yeah.
Yeah. Well, for those of you who are watching the film of this eventually, I did just want to say that the Tony Sarg exhibit will be up all year long, so through December, which is a little longer than we typically have exhibits in the space, in part because of the show, and we knew how popular it would be. In part, we wanted to make sure it was up during Thanksgiving and the parade was going on and have a chance for people to see the parade and then come in and see the show. So I hope you'll come back, and if you haven't seen it already, visit the exhibition. And again, thanks for coming tonight. And guys, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.